Warm welcome to Alana Newhouse, editor-in-chief of Tablet Magazine and the author of the powerful essay, Zionism for Everyone. Alana, great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
With us today is also my co-host and regular contributor to the podcast, Dr. Leif Knutsen. And as mentioned, you recently wrote a wonderful essay, Alana, called Zionism for Everyone, where you basically argue that the intense global focus on Zionism amid rapid technological, social, and civilizational changes isn't primarily about Israel itself. Instead, it's a symptom of a deeper Western crisis over national identity, self-determination, and the future of free societies. I guess at first we have to define what is Zionism and more particularly, what is it today? And should Zionism, rather than being past-oriented, perhaps be understood as a future-oriented nationalism?
Yeah. So Zionism, as it's defined colloquially, and as most of us see it defined in public discourse, is the right of self-determination of the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland in Israel. Um, what I try to do with the piece is I try to broaden the definition and explain how that ideology actually functions today. And the way that I try to explain it is that what I'm trying to animate is the way that Zionism works for peoples. And peoples can live anywhere. And so what I try to, in the piece, and we can get into it, but in the piece, I kind of developed this idea that Zionism is a technology, and it's rooted in this idea of an ethnos, which is not an ethnicity. Ethnos is actually a term from anthropology that means people or cultures. And what Zionism did is it took a culture or a people, and we can talk a little bit about how peoples get made, but it takes a people and then it adds to it a couple of other ingredients, one of which is a very clear forward-looking vision for the future. What do you want to build? How do you want to live? How does this people want to function? Along with ruthless pragmatism to achieve that vision. And if you think about those three things together, in addition to the fact that they do describe what the Jewish people did in the land of Israel, I think they also, interestingly, throw into sharp relief what's missing everywhere else in the West. There are lots of people in the West who have a vision for the future, but they're not pragmatic and they don't work for it. Even more popular is a lot of people work really hard, but they are looking, the vision that they're trying to animate is very past focused. They're trying to revivify a lost legacy of some kind. And what I try to explain in the piece is that without all three of those ingredients, the magic doesn't happen.
Do you think also, in some sense, the West is jealous of our Zionism? With, as you explain also in the piece, that the West is suffering an identity crisis, weak cohesion, fragmentation, loss of trust, and demographic decline. In some sense, the West looks to Israel and wonder, like, what the heck are they doing to prosper so extraordinarily under such conditions?
Yeah, but I do think that that's what's happening, but I think it's useful to understand why. I think that the West has given up subconsciously. I don't know that that this was very overt, but they gave up the idea of nationalism. They gave up the idea that it was okay to have one's own country with borders and specific rights for specific people. And so what now is happening is they see someone else who's standing by that idea, and they feel the chasm between what they have and what the Israelis have. The way that this functions and manifests itself inside of discourse is strange because many Jews don't realize that the West has done that and given up their own rights to their own national dreams. And so the Jews are like, all we want is what you have. We just want the right to have what everybody else has. And everyone else in the West is like, you have something we don't have anymore. Why do you get to have that? And so the envy is complicated, and it needs to be understood, because it's not simply that out of nowhere, everybody in the West decided that they wanted something that Israel had that they never had. It's that they don't realize that they themselves once had this, and in many ways they gave it up.
Yeah, because as in the piece there, you argue that after Second World War, that the West actually made a misdiagnosis of what made Hitler and evil manifest, namely ideology and nation states. They kind of blamed those two things, and that being a misdiagnosis.
Yes, I think that that Europe, Western Europe, was, when confronted by the enormity of the evil that was perpetrated in World War II, sought, quite rightly, I think, and in a very human way, sought answers to how they could have done that. How could we have gone so astray and been so possessed by hatred that we committed these gruesome and enormous crimes? And the diagnosis that they made was that they had been possessed by ideology, but the ideology that they defined, I think, was an ideology of nationalism, that nation states, the nation state was itself the problem. And part of what I try to do in the piece is trace the consequences of that, of their growing discomfort with the nation state, the way that they then broke down their own, the internal logic of their own nation states, and now are left with an absence. They're left with they don't have something, and they've given something up just as somebody else has lived in their principle of that.
Right.
Life?
Yeah, it seems to me that, I've thought a lot about, first of all, your piece was very well written, but it took me a long time to digest it, not because it wasn't clear, but because I realized that I had been living in that sort of goldfish bowl, that I was like, and I think that, I hope that many people read this piece after they've listened to this, also in Norway. But relating this to the Norwegian situation, the idea, because you always also make the point that the evil that was perpetrated during the Nazi period was a function of human nature, something awful that human beings do. But instead, we have tried to sort of attribute it to ideology or systems or constructs or whatever that somehow are outside of our human nature. And that has gotten in the way of taking accountability, both for what happened, right? And understanding that the person looking in the mirror could have been somebody who enabled or perpetrated that stuff, but also our ability to take responsibility for what's going on right now, because we sort of say, well, as long as we don't have this nationalistic ideology, as long as we're not subscribing to this construct, we're safe. You know what I mean? As long as we distance ourselves from this nationalism, it's inconceivable that we could do something as horrible as the Shoah. And
I also think that I think that it's important to understand that ideology can be evil. There are ideologies that are evil. I believe communism is evil. I believe Nazism is evil, right? I think that nationalism is a way that human beings organize how they live, which is different. And I think that understanding and parsing the difference between them is important. Now, nationalism can curdle and grow, metastasize into something that is poisonous. We see it all the time. But nationalism is in and of itself, and certainly culture and peoplehood, which is the more narrowly the root of the thinking that I'm trying to circle around in this piece, is simply the way that human beings, tribes, families organize how they're going to live and spend their resources and use their gifts in life. And that is, I think that that's a distinction that feels important to me to make.
Mm-hmm. But taking the point of view of sort of the Jewish experience and Jewish life, I guess one of the remarkable things is that there's this connection, there's this cohesion that is, I think, stronger than people realized before October 3rd, and it cuts across October 7th, and it cuts across all kinds of other boundaries. So Henrik and I are Norwegian, you're American. This morning we spoke with an Israeli, and yet we weirdly have the same frame of reference around some shared values and, a history that has become identity, the way Micha Goodman would say it. And I wonder if that is something that makes people, unconsciously envious, but certainly perplexed, because they're used to sort of distancing themselves from those impulses.
Yes, I do think so. And I think that part of the conversation, certainly in the West, around identity is I think, a kind of misdirected answer to the challenge that you just articulated, right? People need to understand themselves in space and time. They need context for who they are. Where do I come from? Where do I belong? These are not bad impulses. It is not poisonous to want to belong somewhere and to want to belong with certain people. When we strip away every meaningful metric by which people measured the answers to those questions, they are going to start to come up with other ones.
Mhm.
And so all of a sudden, and I think that this is the part of the piece that I think hasn't really gotten that much attention, but really feels very, very important to me, is the role of technology, right? I I think that there are so many instances of people who, didn't like their families, and then Facebook started. And let's say I'm a knitter. I like to knit. All of a sudden, Facebook allows me to spend my whole day talking to 16 people who also love to knit, right? Now, those people are in Bangladesh, they're in Thailand, they're in Israel, and they are older, younger, they come from all different cultures, and that is wonderful. It's great that you get to talk to people who share in common this interest. But I think that technology then said to people, consciously or not, that can be your family. That can be your tribe. And it can't. It's just a bunch of knitters. And and there was a way in which I understand the loss, and I understand how people were trying to fill the loss. But the way that they filled the loss, I think, ended up creating more absence for them rather than less so. I think it frustrated them, because being in a Facebook group is not being in a family. It is not being in a tribe. It is not being in a community, and it is not being in a nation. And those experiences give human beings something that sitting on a phone in a Facebook group simply cannot provide.
And Alana, can you expound upon ethnos and peoplehood, and how do you understand the concept of peoplehood versus, for example, a nation or a tribe? And we can speak about the Jewish peoplehood, but also can we speak about American peoplehood? How do you understand the concept?
Okay, well, let me walk through it before I get to America, which is the most complicated expression of this, but also in some senses very sophisticated. So the genesis of the piece actually for me came post October 7th as I started to see in online conversation this sneering reference to Israel from the right and the left as an ethno-state. And it's never a compliment when it's used. It's always meant to belittle or to give the effect of something bigoted and small and backward looking. And and the reason for that is because most people think that the roots of the term are in ethnicity, which is a bloodline. And so they believe that the state is made for people who are related by blood. But in fact, when I started to look at it, I realized that ethnostate comes from the term ethnos, which is an anthropological term that actually means people. And what that means is any group of people who are connected by a certain number of distinct tethers. And here's where, the metaphor that I use in the piece is of music. Every group of people creates its own music in how they define themselves as different from other people. The important thing about peoplehood or about culture is not, there aren't that many rules, but the rules are your culture has to be distinct from other cultures around you, and it has to be recognizable as yours, both to your own people and to those around you. That's it. So, for example, throughout history, obviously, bloodline is one way, one tether. And clearly in early human history, bloodline was a very important tether. Not the only one, though. And in fact, in Jews, it works less prominently than people think. But other tethers can be culture. They can be music. They can be the land. It can be anything. So to give you two alternate examples, in Japan, race is a strong tether. If you are not visibly Japanese, even if you move to Japan and you speak fluent Japanese, there is always a distance between you and the wider culture. Doesn't mean you can't be a fully participating member of that culture, but race is important to the majority culture in Japan. Race is not at all important in Israel, thereby creating this unbelievable confusion for people in the West who can't fathom why Israel has people of all different races who function perfectly well in the society together and who are all part of majority culture. Because race is virtually irrelevant in Israel. It is not part of their music. Now, when you think about it in these terms, then you start to define things. And one of the interesting questions is somebody said to me, well, Alana, what's Franceness? This person was French. And I said, you tell me.
Right.
I know when I'm in a system that's been designed by a French person. I can feel it. I can feel the difference between a system that's been designed by a German and a system that's been designed by an Italian. Right? But it is up to the Germans and the Italians and the French to be able to articulate what is their music. And part of the inability to do that is why I think we're in the moment that we're in. Now, America's very unusual. And I think inventive and very creative. And I think part of the reason for the American success story is in how the founders and the original citizens of the country developed new music. And two of the instruments that they embraced were what I call covenant and capital. So in America, America has as its roots the idea that America is exceptional, meaning we are different from other countries because we've been blessed by God. You don't have to believe in the Christian God, as I do not believe in Jesus. I mean, I believe that Jesus was a probably wonderful person who lived, but I do not believe that he's the Son of God. He's not my God. But I do believe that America was blessed by God. You can be any religion, any ethnicity, but believing that there was something special about America. And by the way, you don't even have to believe necessarily better. We can talk about that, but you have to believe there's something different and special about a country that is blessed by God. And it doesn't matter where you're from if you believe that. You can be a Hindu, you can be a Muslim, you can be a Jew, you can be a Catholic. If you believe you live in a country that was blessed by God. That was the first one. And it's unusual, actually. The second one is capital. This is a country that had at its root the idea that non-royals could come here and make royal level wealth. Capitalism and the idea of ambition and progress, and that were central to the American music. Coming here and believing that that was a part of the country, that was a part of the national music, could make you an American. And again, it did not matter where, this was the inventiveness of it. It didn't matter where you came from. It didn't matter what background you had. If you participated in that and believed in it for the majority culture, then that made you an American. And these two tethers, both of which were kind of new on the scene of national definition, turned out to be so strong that they maintained a very large country with a very large landmass of very, very different people. We embraced immigrants from all over the country because we demanded that they sing this music. And it worked.
And speaking of this, I wonder if, because this draws my thoughts to the ethos of the American dream and whether or not the American dream and Zionism has similarities in the sense that Zionism is future oriented, as you spoke of, and the American dream is the land of the free and home of the brave, and it's through hard work, courage, and determination that any individual can achieve upward social mobility, freedom, and a better life regardless of their background. Doesn't this have a lot of similarities with Zionism?
Yes. And the reason is because they were rooted in the Jewish story. The founders of America were inspired directly by the story of the Jews. So it's not that surprising if you think about it.
Life?
But I'm sure that a lot of people who listen to this are going to thinking in the back of the mind that what we're doing is we're really flirting with jingoism.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that some people's, you can only belong to an ethnos if you also define that ethnos as superior to other ethnoses,
So let's get into that, because that gets into the crux of what I think both the challenge and the potential of the idea here is. Note that you do not have to believe that Germany is better than other countries. You just have to believe that it is different. And you have to believe that you want to make Germany into the best version of what that difference is. But you do not have to believe that it is better than other countries. So the reason why this is important is because part of what I believe is really happening here is the technology that we are all living in right now is a flattening technology. It is a technology that attempts to iron out difference and to make difference bad. What I'm trying to do is reanimate difference and ask people whether or not they can live with difference without pushing it into jingoism. That feels like a doable challenge, particularly for the West, because if you have freedom and you have civil liberties, you should be able to do this. We do it with our families all the time. My family is different than my next door neighbor's family. I do not believe that my next door neighbors are my family. My family is simply different. I do not believe that my family is better than my next door neighbors. But we have our own holidays, our own family rituals, our own house. These are things that we have because we are distinct. And it is okay that I have my house and they have their house. And I hope that their house is the most beautiful version of their house that they can make. I simply also want my house to be the most beautiful version of my house that I can make. And you can now say, well, inevitably human beings are going to want to say, well, if your house is so beautiful, you're going to want to take over their house. Okay, well, this is why we have wars. And this is why we have defense. And this is why we maintain balance of power in the world. This is just being an adult in life, right? And that's, to me, it feels very, very important for people to understand. I think it's very useful to realize that America is not imperial. We don't go around, even at the height of our power, we don't go around trying to acquire countries elsewhere. I mean, sometimes people say we want to, but we don't generally go and conquer other countries. We simply want to live. The history of America is the history of a country that wants to live in its own landmass and make its own landmass the best version of what it is.
I think I want to read something, a little part from your piece here, because it's so interesting. I think that the listeners and viewers should hear a little bit from it. It's from here. Let's see. Together, aim to make your collective success so outlandish and so implausible that enemies and strangers can't help but conjure up conspiracy theories about how you could have possibly achieved it. In antiquity, the Jews bequeathed to the world the concept of the nation, as distinct from tribe and empire, which in turn gave rise to modern national identity. Now, with Zionism, Israel has again provided the world with a framework for the future, this time to avoid and transcend the twin impulses toward digital disintegration of identity and self-worship. Don't be so afraid of the gift or so pointlessly resentful of the giver that you'd deprive yourself and those around you of what you deserve.
So in there, I'm trying my best to explain, just to answer Leif's question, I'm trying my best to encourage people to live in what I think is actually quite a large middle area. This is not about, as I try to say, this is not about self-worship. This is not about us shading into a kind of poisonous jingoism, nor is it about completely blanking ourselves out and saying that there's no difference between us and anybody else. And we are fine just becoming this trackless landscape of human flesh. There's something between those two. And that something between those two is literally how humans have organized themselves since the beginning of recorded history. So it can't be that hard for us to figure out how to live back in that space.
Do you think you can belong to several peoplehoods at the same time?
Um, it's a good question. I do. I am an American and I am also a Jew. And so I belong to two different peoples. So I do think you can, but I think that it's important to understand this idea of the majority culture. That when I am in America, for example, I understand that America is a Christian nation, and have I do not work to undo that. In fact, I honor that part of the majority culture, even as it's not one of the tethers that I share with the majority culture. So I think it's important to understand that if you do participate in multiple peoples.
I wanted to, because you cited, Annika Rothstein, or Herrnrot-Rothstein, as she would say, as we would say here in Scandinavia. And of course, she talks about conditions in Sweden, which aren't that, it's not that far from us. It's really just a few miles.
Right.
And based partly on your essay and other things that I've written, it feels like I'm seeing something that I can't unsee, which is this unraveling of, to use your term, this sort of disintegration of our ethnos, our various ethnoses in Europe. And so I realize that you're not in Europe, but an outside look might be really helpful here, because this is something that greatly worries me, because I think this identity crisis, if you can call it that, is leading very rapidly to an existentialist crisis, because we just don't have the antibodies against people who have a strong but imperialistic, to put it that way, impulse to take over.
What's interesting about the response to the piece is my American readers seemed a little confused by the piece. They were kind of mystified. The Israelis absolutely did not understand what I was talking about. They were like, nobody's jealous of us. You're a mental patient. Like, they just thought I was out to lunch. The Europeans are the ones who got it and got it immediately. The European readers, I think that within an hour of publishing a very long piece, I must have received 5 or 6 emails, and they were all from European readers. It was shocking. And that piece has now been translated all over Europe. And I'm here. Like, I don't think it's an accident that European readers did not need me to hold their hand for this one. They really did get what I was trying to say.
And so what's your diagnosis of the situation in Europe?
I mean, I think it's because I'm a writer, I always prefer referring back to the way that I've written it, because I'm trying my best to articulate something in a way that I think would be most useful. I try to diagnose it in the piece. I do think that Europe, and again, Europe is not a thing. We should talk about specific nations and specific peoples, because I think there's a difference. But I do wish for Europe and for European nations, that they would ask themselves this question: what is Norwegianness? What is the Norwegian music? What is Franceness? What is Germanness? And not be afraid to come up with an answer that is distinct. It's okay to be different. In fact, it's the only way forward. And so figuring out how to distinguish yourselves and how to articulate how you distinguish yourself feels really, really vital at this moment, because I think that one of the things that happened in Europe is in many ways, I guess it's arguable that Europe was kind of a precursor to the flattening, because for a variety of reasons that have to do with post-World War II international organizations and then globalization, all of which happened before the technology wave, Europe started to flatten itself. Even the fact that we're talking about Europe as though it's one thing, I am flattening it when it's not, right?
Yeah.
So, but Europe did that. Europe created the idea that there is some mass called Europe, and we should talk about it as an entity. When in fact, if we really want to have this conversation, we should look at it peoples by people and figure out, diagnose and analyze each culture as separate.
But if I could challenge you a little bit, I mean, part of the reason why I think Israelis were just confused by the piece is because everything you're describing is in the air they breathe, right? It's not like they contemplate, oh, what are the criteria for nationhood that want us to make out and put our lives on the line to protect our neighbors, or what is it? It's just something they live and breathe. And of course, there's issues about including the Arab population and the Haredi population and so forth. And we, at least in Norway, we used to have that shared narrative. We used to have this thing that we could describe as Norwegian, and then it seems like this sort of radical left has like browbeaten us so badly about these things by accusing us of racism and jingoism and all these things, that we haven't really got a chance to sort of recover and say, well, no, wait a minute, maybe there's a different way to look at that. But I don't think that we in this country, and I don't think in Sweden either, are in a place where we can have that discussion without yelling at each other and making things worse.
I hear that. And it's not like I come from a country where our political discourse is quiet and calm and where it feels like we can have measured intellectual conversations very easily. The thing that I would tell you, though, is that history moves, usually driven by small networks of people who band together. Part of what I do at one point in the piece, I just say, like, call your artists, call your historians. They're out of work. Like, you don't need the force of some of the current movements in order to start to ideate an answer to this question. In fact, the ideation of that answer probably should happen with a much smaller group of like-minded people who can challenge each other and have trust with each other, so that they can start to articulate it. And if you do articulate something that's powerful, people flock to it. So Israel's a great example. If you go and you look at the number of people that went to Israel to establish that nation, it's a joke. That's the reason for the end of the piece. The reason that people come up with these conspiracy theories about Israel is because they cannot imagine that 11 bedraggled people, half of whom had actually just come out of Auschwitz, created a whole country by themselves. It's like impossible to imagine, except it is what happened. Mm-hmm. Because small groups of people with very clear ideas and a belief in themselves and in rooting in history, that's how all of human history moves forever. So I understand the feeling in this moment. I think that for some of my friends in Europe, they feel similarly, they feel trapped between a left that refuses any of these ideas, refuses the idea of difference at all, and refuses the idea of the nation state at all. And as you put it, increasingly in many European countries, a jingoistic right that appears driven by a desire to revive a past right. Greatness, revive past greatness that then inevitably leads to dark places. So where does that leave a thoughtful person? And the answer is in the middle with everyone else. And I guess I would just encourage it. I would love to see small groups of people in different countries just start to work together, just articulate it, just come up with I would at Tablet run a forum. If people wanted to give me an essay, this is Japanese-ness. This is Norwegian-ness. And have 2, 3, 4 people work together to come up with something that was music that was distinct. I think it could be very powerful.
And basically you're saying, yeah, me too. Basically you're saying like, let's start celebrating our differences again and what makes us unique. And basically saying that it's not a zero-sum game. If you want to be the best you can be, doesn't mean automatically stepping on your neighbor or other people. Is like, that doesn't have to be a zero-sum game.
I actually think that I think that if you follow the idea that it's a zero-sum game to its natural conclusion is communism.
Right.
Right? You are no different than anyone else. There is nothing special about you. Then if there's nothing special about you, then just let the state run everything. I don't believe that. I want people to be, I believe that people's contributions happen when they understand what's different about themselves, truly. Anybody who's, but it's like, there's a part of this that starts to become a little bit frustrating, not with you guys, but when you have these conversations, because you're just like, have you ever run a staff? Could you imagine if I ever looked at my staff and I said, I need you to be like him? It's just impossible. You can't do that. What I want is I want you to be the best version of you. I want you to actually understand what is unique about you and manifest that. And then I want him to understand what's unique about him and manifest that. That is the only way it works. Because I particularly don't make widgets. I'm not just in a factory making something that's mindless. It's life. And I think that without encouraging people to live inside of distinction, you're just flattening us all into some big mush.
You know, if I may, and you may be familiar with this, but one of the most interesting examples is the formation of communities within the displaced persons camps after the Shoah. I mean, this is my great passion. You know, if I could spend a few years working on that, I would. But the things that they were able to accomplish, having been traumatized, you know, were destitute, you know, in some cases without hope, and they still were able to self-govern, have political parties, elections. They built schools, they built yeshivas, they even built universities. They had their own currency, lots of newspapers. In the space of a few years, in a space where they were desperate to get out of, on top of everything else.
You know, I'll tell you my favorite. I'm also similarly obsessed with DP camp culture. And I'll tell you my favorite anecdote. So about 15 or 16 years ago, I did a piece for the New York Times about Roman Vishniak, photographer.
A
photographer of Eastern European Jewish life before the Holocaust. And the piece was about a young researcher who's my age, who had discovered the fullness of his archive. And so I was trying to trace her story about how she came to discover it. And she grew up in Los Angeles, and she was the daughter of her grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. Her grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and she grew up with them and her mother in Los Angeles. And she recalls sitting one day in their house in Los Angeles eating chocolate rum balls out of a big sterling silver dish. That in her family, the understanding was this was a dish from the Alteheim. This was a dish from the old world, from their life before the Holocaust. And she's staring at this very heavy sterling silver dish. And she thinks to herself, wait a minute. These people went into a bunch of work camps and they trekked through Siberia. How did they take this bowl with them? And then that thought deepened when she realized that the other piece of her inheritance from the Altenheim was a full set of Rosenthal china.
Mm.
Now, what she eventually learned was that, in fact, those items were not from pre-war life. They were from DP camps.
Right.
Why? Because Jews frequently bartered in DP camps. They would get a cigarette, they would barter from chocolate to cigarettes and then up, all the way into visas to get out. And they would collect these items as their, and when they would keep them, if they would keep them because it was all they had in the world, that became their their inheritance, right? That became their legacy. But it's not from their pre-war life. It's actually from their DP life. But what it shows is what you were just talking about, that even inside of DP camps, these people could not help but make a culture.
Right.
That impulse is what makes life.
If I could share another anecdote with you, if you want to take that with you, when the Jews from Norway were deported, there was one train from Trondheim that was delayed, and so they were put in a woman's prison, actually. And the first thing they did was they organized a school for the kids there. None of the kids survived ultimately, but that was the first thing they did, was to arrange for them to have a school.
It means you believe in the future. It you know, the idea that you would come out of a DP camp, you look around, you'd hear that a huge percentage of the people who you knew before the war were dead, potentially including your whole family.
Mm-hmm.
All the buildings that you were familiar with were burned out or destroyed, your town, everything. And instead of giving up or worse, right? You start looking for Rosenthal china, you're alive.
Yeah.
And to me, that I wish I could bottle that.
Belief in the future and a belief in life. While we're on the topic of the Holocaust and Second World War, I want to ask you, because as you mentioned in the piece, you talk about this Western misdiagnosis of the reasons for Second World War as being nationalism and ideology. And if you were to say, like, if it wasn't those things, what do you think are the most important drivers between the Holocaust, for the Holocaust and for the Second World War?
Just explain to me again. So you want to know if it's not what I said?
Yeah, if it's since it's not nationalism and ideology being the most important factors for
Oh,
the
what
Second
caused the
World War.
Holocaust?
Yeah, what caused it?
Okay. So this one I'm going to leave to other people, including historians, which I'm not. I am a journalist, and you should not look to journalists for your history ever. PSA. Um, what I would say, though, is that I believe that anti-Semitism is not a cause, it is a symptom. So anti-Semitism emerges in societies that are in strain somehow. I think the reemergence of anti-Semitism today in the West, which has a lot of factors to it, I believe has fundamentally the root cause of it is technology, by which I don't mean that the technology is bad, but technology is creating a whole host of pretty massive and comprehensive changes to our lives and our economy and the way that we communicate with each other, the way that we organize our lives. And I think we are maybe not quite conscious of the strain that it is putting on us individually, communally, nationally, internationally. The strain is pressuring, it's putting pressure on societies in a way that I think historically causes them to generate anti-Semitism. And so without articulating the history of World War II here, or trying to describe standing on one foot, how the Holocaust happened, I do think that it's important, given what we're going through today, the important thing to think about is why and how does anti-Semitism emerge, and why is it emerging right now for us?
Well, can I make a suggestion and tell me
Yeah,
what you think?
please.
And that is that as sort of our own, as our sense of ethnos is sort of disintegrating in Europe, in different European countries, we're feeling an unconscious loss, right? And in some cases, that loss is felt like the loss of a utopic future, which is sort of the communist, socialist kind of neurosis, if you will. And and the other one is a sense of loss of a past that never existed but still seems real, which is sort of the fascist right wing point of view. And then when they see that Israel and Jews aren't beset in the same way by that sense of loss, but instead, find some purpose. Um, you know, uh, there's, right now I've been listening a lot to Micha Goodman, and he's like saying, Talmud is, slow thinking, right? It totally mobilizes your system to brain. And then, the Jews come across as the eternal antagonist because they disprove the righteousness of letting go of all of that. Does that make sense? Am I?
It does. I think that how we process loss and the past feels actually more important than we give it credit for. Um, Maybe because therapy culture has created an obsession with our individual pasts and our individual losses. And that obsession, I think, does create neurosis, right?
Mhm.
But the flip side of that is not to simply imagine that you emerged ab ovo and you're just like some new thing that's existed and you don't come from anything, right? The flip side of that neurotic self-obsession is the ability to metabolize your past in a way that is powerful for you and in a way that is inspiring for what you want to build for the future. So if you want me to give a kind of a personal example, in the last 10 years, I've lost both my parents, right? That is a natural fact of life. Um, it is also painful and it is a loss. I can process that loss by saying, now I am a person, I am an orphan. I am a person who has no parents. I am characterized by loss and I can live with that loss. The other thing to do is I can basically be like, well, those people were cool, but whatever. It's not relevant to my life anymore. Or I can find a way to keep my parents with me and to animate them in my daily life and to animate and to remember them and to have them inspire parts of my current life and to get strength from who they were and from my memories of them and not to run away from it. It's neither a resistance and a kind of isolation from one's past, nor is it an obsession with it.
Mhm.
And again, I think we're talking about these middle roads that once felt like second nature to humans.
Mhm.
The grief of one's parents, of tribes, of things that your community has been through, that's literally what history was. And then we built rituals around it and holidays around it, and that was okay. And we didn't think of it as macabre or as something that we needed to obsess over, nor did we think of it as something that we needed to cut away and pretend didn't happen.
the integration of loss in a positive, constructive manner. I also want to ask you, because juxtaposing the Zionism that was spoken of here with Sam Harris's recent thoughts about the topic, where he basically argues that Zionism is actually being weaponized against us. What do you make of those thoughts, Alana?
I mean, obviously, there's whole parts of what Sam says that I agree with. The part that of the conversation around Sam's article that I obviously am allergic to is, and Sam didn't say this, but it led to a conversation about whether or not we need to retire the term Zionism.
Mm-hmm.
And Zionism is a thing that we had in the past, which feels exactly like this impulse. Okay, now this is a part of our past. It's actually thousands of years old, but we're going to actually retire it. Why? Because 6 left-wing activists have decided that they want to target me because of it. You think it's because of the term?
Right.
It's not because of the term. In fact, the term is your clue that you should embrace it.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, people saying we need to abrogate this term, we need to get rid of it, get it off us, the term is radioactive, was actually my clue that I had been right in my essay.
Yeah.
Because this term is radioactive for a reason. They want us to get rid of it so that nobody else can use it. They want the Jews to not have a state and the Jews to not have self-determination, because if the Jews can't, nobody can. There is not a people right now that has a stronger claim to their nation historically, right? Archaeologically. If we don't have it, the Norwegians don't have it. If we don't have it, the French don't have it. If we don't have it, the Germans don't have it. And I actually think that we're not the target. We're just in the way.
Mm-hmm.
And so when people start to say, let's get rid of Zionism, my feeling is you get rid of Zionism, the whole wave crashes.
Yeah, it's funny. Henrik and I were having a discussion about this the other day, and we were talking about the future. And I said, I'm a lot more confident that the Jewish people will exist in 500 years than I am that Norway will exist in 500 years.
Yeah.
Well, let's hope for both.
Yes, of course. but just that sense, that sentiment, because that's all it is. I have no way of predicting the future, obviously, but
I do think that, 4,000 years is not that long in the history of existence, but it's pretty long in the history of human recorded history. I understand the impulse of people to say, the Jews were here before our latest enemies and will be here afterwards. What I would encourage is, and it's what I'm trying to encourage in the piece, is I'm trying to encourage a more generous, open-handed impulse on the other side of that, which is to say, here's how we did it. Is there anything that can be gleaned from the history of the Jews for other peoples who are now struggling, as Jews have, with challenges to their peoplehood? Remember that when the Jews were thrown into the diaspora, could you imagine being one of those Jews at that time? If you said there's no way this people is going to exist in 5 years, nobody would have argued with you.
Right.
Right? So I understand that it feels hopeless, or I understand why it can feel hopeless. But I also want to say that the history of the Jews is about taking hopeless moments and seeing the hope in it. And figuring out where's my one point of purchase here? Where's the one thing I can hold on to? How do I create a sense of connectivity with other people and build something from that?
That's a great way to end this episode. Thank you so much, Alana, for joining us here and speaking with us.
Guys, thank you so much. That was great. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.